Check, check. This time.
Um, Hello? Andrea? Andrea, you're going to be in the front row. This is the speakers area? Yeah. Just get these guys organized. Okay, thanks. Good. Good evening, my lovely. So everyone's in. All right. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for braving the weather, you intrepid explorers and guests. It's quite an evening to have to fight to get here. Anyway, welcome to the second session of the inaugural Global Conservation Forum. This event marks a significant stride towards shaping a robust conservation and sustainability profile for the Explorers Club. Through captivating stories of research, projects, and individual experiences, we will highlight the urgency and potential of conservation and sustainability for the club, its members, and the potential of conservation and the future of life and on Earth and beyond. Through education and outreach, we plan to keep our members informed of the latest concepts, policies, and practices, and demonstrate the monumental benefits achievable through the successful conservation of biodiversity and development of sustainable practices for a healthy planet. I'm Bonnie Wiper. I'm a member of the Explorers Club, a member of the Conservation and Sustainability Committee, and the representative to the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. Before I begin, we have a tradition here at the club of asking who in the audience is here for the first time. Good. Well, we invite you to come back. We have lots of really interesting lectures, sort of quirky lectures on subjects you will never be able to find anyplace else in New York. It's a great session, it's a great series, and please come. Tickets are inexpensive and it's open to the public. But also we have Oceans Week, we have Climate Week, we have all kinds of things going on at this club. It's just an amazing place. Oh, and I have another task, which I'm very pleased to perform, which is to thank the wonderful Conservation Sustainability Committee. Martin Krause, who is also on the board of the Explorers Club, and co-chair with Natalie Cash, who is at the WCS, head of their filming department. Brandy DeCarly, who can't be with us tonight, she has started a fabulous company called Farm from a Box. And Satish Venkatesh, who is currently in Sri Lanka working on his Fulbright and studying elephants. So it's a talented, wonderful, Natalie designed this for us, which is beautiful. It's a talented, committed, and very passionate group. So I'm very honored to be a part of it. Our goal in this group is to integrate conservation and sustainability into the very fabric and identity of the Explorers Club. This is the future of exploration, from the smallest phytoplankton to outer space. Sustainability and the preservation of biodiversity on Earth and beyond illuminates the intricacies of our own species' survival on Earth and gives us valuable insights into the natural processes of our planet and the profound impact our actions have on our collective destiny. So thank you to a great team. I wish all of you were here tonight, but thank you for those who are, to those who are. Now, I have one other thing. I lied when I said I only had one thing to go before getting this started. A special thanks to Richard Garriott, our president, and Will Roseman, our executive director, without whose endorsement of this would never have happened. Yeah. And to the incomparable staff at the club who have worked on this. Kevin Murphy, Felix Freeland, who is back there, organizing everything with Louis Mugga, who is a member and a AV expert, and Jenna O'Connor, who organizes all the catering and external events, who you will never see without a smile. And then, of course, a special call out to Joseph Yoon, the world's biggest ambassador for delicious insect dining. So now it's my pleasure to introduce a really fabulous person who I first heard speak about 7 years ago and who I have been trying to find ever since and was lucky enough to find through the Council on Foreign Relations and Brock Bosson, who you know, who's a member of the club. Vonda Felbab Brown is a senior fellow at the Strobe Talbot Center for Security, Strategy, and Technology in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. She is the director of the Initiative on Non-State Armed Actors. She is also the co-director of the African Security Initiative and the Brookings series on opioids, the opioid crisis in America, domestic and international dimensions. Previously, she was the co-director of the Brookings Project Improving Global Drug Policy, as well as another Brookings project, reconstituting local orders. She is an expert on international and internal conflicts and non-traditional security threats, including insurgencies, organized and transnational crime, urban violence, and illicit economies. She has her field work and research have covered, among others, Afghanistan, South Asia, Burma, Indonesia, the Andean region, Mexico, Morocco, Somalia, and Eastern Africa. Falba Brown is the author of The Extinction Market, which is where I first heard you speak, Wildlife Trafficking, How to Counter It. She also has written Militants, Criminals, and Warlords, The Challenge of Local Government in an Age of Disorder. I have a group of books that I've listed. I'm not going to go through all of them, but just in deference to the audience attention. But they are legion. She is a prolific writer and really an expert on things that you and I never get to see and don't want to see. So she is also the author of numerous policy reports, academic articles, and opinion pieces, a frequent commentator in U.S. and international media. Falba Brown regularly provides congressional testimony on these orders, on these issues. She has a PhD from MIT and a BA from Harvard. And I also want to mention that Monday, hold on, we have another, I think it's right here. We have another crime-fighting lecture by Olivia Swank Goldman, who is the executive director of the Wildlife Justice Commission, which is a really super organization that spends a lot of time fighting wildlife crime. She's executor of the nonprofit Wildlife Justice Commission. Olivia leads a lean and efficient team of law enforcement experts, investigators, crime analysis, etc. She is going to be here Monday night as part of our Monday night lecture series, so please do come. And come back to the Explorers Club. Join us for our lectures and our events. We would love to have you all. I'm going to turn this over to Vanda. You guys are going to have to share one on either side.
Well, thank you very much, Bonnie, for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. I explore people at the margins, people like terrorists, insurgents. I have spent a lot of time over the past 2 decades interacting with groups like the Taliban in Afghanistan, Al-Shabaab, Mexican criminal cartels, groups in Colombia. And so it's a great pleasure to be at the Explorers Club thinking about different forms of exploration. And it's a great pleasure to be sharing the audience, the podium rather, with a terrific group of people who, like I and like everyone else in the audience, is passionate about conservation. And it's very many dimensions, one of which today is poaching and wildlife trafficking. Those are not new issues. They have been part of discussions about conservation for decades. But they have become far more central, far more intense in their form, far more structured. To put it very simplistically, we have really seen the professionalization of both poaching and wildlife trafficking, driven by many factors, one of which is far greater demand over the past 2 decades, growing, that we have seen historically. The number of affluent people in various parts of the world desiring to acquire, consume in one form or another some part of an animal is far greater than was the case at other times in history. And we are also seeing increasing interaction between poaching and wildlife trafficking and other forms of criminality, which is what we are going to be exploring today in our conversation and with you. So I started a lot of my career working really on drugs and insurgency. And kind of early on, in the beginning of the 2000s, I was working on the nexus of insurgency, terrorism, and drug trafficking, what came to be known as nexus of terrorism and trafficking. And ended up doing work on lots of different crime markets, lots of different drug smuggling, but was always a very passionate conservationist, very passionate bird watchers. I was telling Bonnie that in my very early childhood, I really badly wanted to be a conservation biologist, and I'm still sad today that I went in a different direction. But at around the time of 2008, 2009, I started being asked by conservation biology departments, folks in environmental NGOs, such as Oxford University, University of Kent, some of the very prominent conservation biology places, WWF, Wildlife Conservation Society, to come and talk with the biologists, with folks involved in conservation, about what lessons carry from counter-narcotics, what lessons carry from thinking about counterinsurgency, counter-terrorism, and which don't. And at around the time, we started hearing more and more about the equivalent of what is the nexus of crime and terrorism, the convergence, the nexus across various illegal economies. And some of the information that started coming out was false. There were a lot of exaggerations, lots of myths, lots of convenient labeling of others one did not like as poachers. So for example, for a while there was a big story about Al-Shabaab being keenly responsible for the poaching of elephants. Never quite true. Al-Shabaab was taxing the smuggling of ivory through Somalia. But there were a lot of Kenyan actors who were critical poachers who were saying, oh, it's Al-Shabaab, it's not us. Nonetheless, the reality that militant actors can be involved in poaching was becoming more and more dramatically evident. From very surprising actors, like the Taliban had its role in allowing poaching for Saudi and Emirati-rich Gulf personalities coming to Afghanistan to hunt Hubara bastards with sacred falcons, for example, just as various militant actors like Shabab were allowing them to come hunt cheetah and endangered antelopes in Somalia. So it didn't mean that there were no connections, and the connections were growing as the cat, to use a pun, was out of the bag. As it became obvious that wildlife crime was one aspect in which insurgents and criminal groups can become involved and profit. Now, sometimes the connections are very complex, sometimes they are very surprising. Perhaps we'll have opportunities to get into some of the contradictions. I spent a lot of the past 20 years working on Mexican cartels. And here is how several years ago the connections across different types of criminality came poignantly together. As we are speaking today, 300 Americans have died of fentanyl poisoning. Every day in the United States, 300 Americans die. Canada's death rates are roughly equivalent, and the use is spreading in Mexico. In a matter of time, synthetic opioids like fentanyl will start hitting the world. We're seeing various equivalents emerging in Europe, for example. Now, the principal traffickers and producers of fentanyl are Mexican cartels, such as the Chapitos branch of the Sinaloa cartel and Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación. But the angle that became really surprising was that not only were they using some of the same smuggling routes, some of the same actors, such as Costa Rican fishermen fishing illegally for carrying cocaine, for enabling the carry of precursors. Several years ago, they actually started to pay back in wildlife products to their Chinese criminal counterparts for precursors for fentanyl. And here is really where we saw convergence across crime coming together in a way that if it's not the apex, it certainly reached a new level of what we have not been seeing before. Actual value transfer, payment transfer system, enabling the evading of established practices of anti-money laundering, coinciding with much greater international complexity as well as complexity across illegal economies. And so today, when we think about combating wildlife crime, we are really looking not just at the crime itself, but very different connections to public health. There is no greater public health crisis now that we are in post-COVID than fentanyl in the United States. Of course, COVID itself, zoonotic pandemics remain an enormous threat. One of the biggest tragedies of COVID-19 was that it ended up being a wasted catastrophe. We have really not adapted in any serious way to preventing, truly preventing, not just mitigating the spread of zoonotic diseases. So thinking about wildlife trafficking really involves thinking about interactions with the wide variety of threats and connections to illegal economies, as well as to actors across a wide panoply of the space, the militants, the criminals, but also corrupt governments or good governments or good government officials that are trying to counter it, NGOs that are trying to counter it, communities, indigenous communities, wildlife defenders who are often left at great mercy and threat of violent actors. And I couldn't imagine a better panel to be exploring those issues with us today than we have. We are going to use a different format than yesterday. Rather than set speeches, we will have a fireside type conversations among us. I will introduce each of them as I ask them questions. So let me start with Monique right here on my right. Monique Sosnowski is assistant professor at Farmingdale State College, SUNY in New York. She is an assistant professor of criminal justice and someone who has spent a lot of time thinking about the intersection of criminal justice and conservation. I should also say that Monique has a deep specialty in West African security issues and has a book that just come out, or any day will come out, called Operation Crevette, Benin Mercenaries and the Survival of a New State. And I highly recommend it to any of you who are interested in foreign policy. Coastal West Africa, Benin have become major focus for the United States as jihadi militancy is sweeping West Africa. Our traditional allies have, or our traditional partners have gone away to Russia and the Wagner Group. Jihadis are spreading across the Sahel. We are looking at Benin as a place to have new bases with the United States. So read Monique's book, not just about conservation, but also to understand how viable a place like Benin is for US military bases. But back to conservation, Monique. You have done a lot of work on thinking about convergence. Can you give us a spectrum of what convergence means? What are the different dimensions? Where are you seeing it with respect to terrestrial issues, marine issues?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for the introduction. So I think the issue of convergence with conservation has become a really important focal point that academics, policymakers, government have really been looking at increasingly over the last several years, coming out of a lot of what Vanda has already mentioned in terms of terrorism and drug trafficking nexuses with conservation. So convergence, when it comes to any type of criminal justice issue, we can say, is essentially the intersection with criminal justice or crime, at least two different crime types coming together in this format, we're really talking about wildlife crime, wildlife poaching, converging with different types of crime in itself. So I've been looking at convergence over the past several years. This really started with looking at wildlife conservation and drug trafficking, which was kind of one of the primary areas that we could look into when it came to, we've spent so much time looking at drug trafficking, what can we learn, as Vanda was saying, and what can we apply to wildlife conservation. But kind of taking this cat out of the bag, we've really come to see that wildlife crime and trafficking is converging not only with narcotics, but with arms trafficking, with human trafficking, with money laundering, with really most things you can think of when it comes to organized crime and transnational crime. And importantly, it's not something that only exists in the terrestrial sphere. We tend to think of a lot of conservation issues with wildlife poaching on land. We think of, Africa, we think of elephants, we think of kind of our large species that we first and foremost associate conservation issues with. But as was kind of already touched on, this is something that exists in the marine sphere, something that we're seeing with illegal fishing, something that we're really seeing cover a lot more area, a lot newer dimensions in terms of how products are moved, who's being involved with these illicit economies, and all informing at the end of the day how we can actually improve law enforcement, improve our investigations, improve our policies to really come in and try to stop these issues from happening.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Give
Yep.
the mic to Keith. So Keith, I said that I wanted to be a conservation biologist, and I envy all the conservation biologists next to me and in the audience. I also really wanted to be a homicide detective.
It's never too late.
And you're someone who's coming to the panel to dealing with wildlife trafficking after a glamorous distinguished career in law enforcement, covering different agencies, different investigative work. And now you are leading the wildlife and environmental trafficking unit at Homeland Security Investigations. Those of you who might not know HSI, it's one of the largest, perhaps the largest. Are you guys bigger than FBI?
No, FBI is larger than we are. They have about 10,000 agents.
Still, you'll catch them up.
We have about 7,000.
But much larger than drug enforcement agencies, double the size of DA, for example, and significantly larger than U.S. Fish and Wildlife, that since the 1970s only has 200 investigators, senior special agents and investigators. Flatline despite the enormous rise in wildlife trafficking. But we have Keith, and he is doing the good fight. So Keith, why does HSI care?
Well, I think we've always cared to a point, because when we talk about the investigative portfolio with wildlife crime and environmental crimes, us and our legacy components with the U.S. Customs Service, it was always existed within our program set. It was investigations usually that were intercepted at the border and then try to follow the networks in. But that all began to shift around 2013 when President Obama had his executive order dealing with wildlife trafficking. And that really set the stage for the federal government, and especially the executive branches, to, a unity of effort, a whole of government approach to try to come together and address this problem set, both internally and across our borders. That's continued under the last two administrations, where both of their transnational organized crime strategies have identified that, yes, this is a threat. And then even more so now with the creation of our unit, it was requested by Congress to specifically address certain issues, first and foremost convergence. They wanted to know, what is the threat of the convergence issues, whether it's multi-species, whether it's multi-polycriminality, whether it's multinational, with different networks coming together, to really get an understanding of the threat picture. So that's what we were created for, was first and foremost to deal with that convergence issue. Second, with the convergence issues go hand in hand, is the amount of funding. I mean, if we're looking at just in wildlife trafficking alone, World Bank conservative estimates, $21 billion a year. So now if we integrate that in with mining, logging, you're now pushing 214, 230, depending on which numbers you're looking at, which are actually probably much more on the conservative side, especially once you include mining. So that amount of money that can be generated as illicit proceeds, and more importantly, where is that now going? So, and we know when we're dealing with these other transnational criminal organizations, when we're dealing with destabilized states, military juntas, when you're dealing with basically nationalized mercenary groups that are using these as revenues to further perpetuate what they're doing. And finally, the concerns with zoonotic disease. I mean, it's a very real disease, even if you pull the COVID equation out of it and the arguments over it, just the history of it and how, like you said, the threat is there and we've failed to not really recognize it. So how can we better work together to put our best practices forward to address all three of these issues? And that's what the unit was created for.
Well, the spectrum of threats is very large, and we are very fortunate that you're the one standing up the unit. Since I am not in the government, I can add another threat or something that I am thinking increasingly about. Zoonotic diseases being very high on my list, but it's also increasingly the other threats to national security. So if you think of illegal fishing and Chinese flotillas often having several hundred ships, depleting very rapidly natural resources, engaging in bottom trawling, devastating potentially shark species in a very particular area very rapidly. I also wonder what are the risks that these flotillas can be carrying spy equipment around Latin America? What are the risks that some of these fishing flotillas can be used as maritime militias for a conflict in the South China Sea? Something that we should perhaps also bear in mind. Luis, Alex Deegan yesterday wonderfully introduced you. I'm not going to use all the wonderful all the wonderful adjectives that he used, but they are absolutely true. But he showed this really very powerful picture of what illegal mining does, deforestation, your work. I want to ask you to tell us about the work that you are doing on illegal mining and how that intersects with other illegal economies. So let me introduce a little bit Luis. Luis Fernandez is a tropical ecologist. He is a research professor of biology at Wake Forest University. He's also a fellow at the Sabin Center for Environment and Sustainability and a visiting scholar at the Carnegie Institution for Science Department and Global Ecology at Stanford. And crucially, Luis is the executive director and co-founder of the Center for Amazonian Scientific Innovation. So please take us to the Amazon. We don't have that great picture, but describe to us the convergence and the devastation that you are fighting against.
Of course. Well, thank you. And I do want to say that I am a scientist. I started off as a scientist, and I always wanted to just work in the forest. And I grew up here in New York. I'm a kid from Queens, first generation, and I grew up in a place that didn't have any green, and I just wanted to work in forests. And I feel a little fish out of water because I'm not a law enforcement specialist. I don't haven't been trained on that, but I actually have become a specialist in illegal networks of metals and of wildlife and of logging and of humans. Because what I see in my work is that to get anything done, you have to understand the networks that exist, that create things that seem simple, like deforestation, someone cutting down a forest because they want to do something, which is essentially what that act is. But it is embedded in a context that the reasons for why they do that are usually not of the making of the person with the chainsaw. And the products that they create through that act are trafficked across state borders, national borders, across continents. And they're blended, that value that's created are blended with many illicit things. So that's all kind of fancy words, but let me kind of take you and tell you what it looks like using less fancy language. If you were here yesterday, you saw the image of what looked like a piece of the Sahara in the middle of the Amazon rainforest, which is in and of itself an image that, I mean, to this day, if I bring anybody down there, they pretty much burst into tears because you go through the forest in this, basically this ATV, glorified ATV, and there's forests and monkeys, and you basically cross this boundary where you see some trees starting to thin, then you see a lot of dead trees, and then it's the Sahara for 25 kilometers to the horizon. How can that happen? It's because of gold. That gold is demanded because of the price of gold, yes, but because of cartels that are facilitating that farmers, migrants to the area, basically do it in the fastest, cheapest, and most environmentally destructive way, which is to use mercury, to chop down forests, to basically mine the soils that are underneath these trees to get gold. And we're talking about a gram per ton of sediment, half a gram. That's, that tells you need a lot of land to get anything out of there. And they're using the same technologies that they're using that were 500 years ago. To be able to do that, you need capital. The capital comes from illicit actors. So you had said something about the professionalization of something that was, at least Americans understand that California, you had your gold miners with panning for gold. They still use that same technology, but now the support systems for the 50,000 or 60,000 miners that have invaded Madre de Dios, which is one of the areas I work, are supported by sophisticated illegal networks that are blended from narco traffic, human trafficking, wildlife trafficking, and logging networks. And in some areas, illegal fishing mafias, the type that killed Dom Phillips, a UK Guardian reporter last year. So when you have kind of those headwinds, many times you have people that start mining because the price of gold is big and you don't want to be a farmer if you can get some gold out under your land. And then that generates value. That value attracts more illicit actors going, hey, there's something here. So let's get into the business. And then at some point, there is a tipping point where the security of the state, many times, the governments basically see this as a problem. So we are now going to send law enforcement using our traditional methods to go and essentially crack heads. We're going to go down there, we're going to blow some stuff up, and then there's a feeling that, okay, it's a little more difficult than just kind of mining and no one's going to pay attention, because that usually lasts for like between 5 and 10 years. Eventually, there's some pressure, maybe USAID or somebody in a country say, you got to do something about that Amazon problem. So they go and do something about that Amazon problem, but then they're like, price of gold is still over $2,000 an ounce. There's money to be made, and someone's going to make it, because the presence of the state is still weak, there's still lots of poverty, and there's still massive corruption. That continues to get corrupted in this vicious cycle because you're now spreading the money you generate from gold, one of the most value-dense substances that you can just pull out of the dirt. So you have this perfect storm of having the professionals come in, because they provide security, they provide more efficient corrupting mechanisms for not just the local cops or the local judges, but things that go up to minister level or beyond, and connect them with existing illicit networks, transnational networks. The mercury, there's an adage, with no mercury, there's no gold. That mercury comes from mines that have been reopened by cartels. Those mines were colonial mines established 400 years ago that were quiet for centuries. They have been reopened, and they've been trafficked by Mexican cartels in a pipeline that goes to Bolivia, that gets distributed to Brazil, Peru, and now Ecuador. So it's not just a local problem. It's not just a guy with a chainsaw or with a shovel. It is something that is now much more complex and much more difficult to pull up. It affects everything. It affects the efficiency in which wildlife is trafficked, because the one thing that mining does, it actually fragments forests and creates much more of an interface between forest and non-forest. And that is essentially the factor for zoonotic diseases. You have people that have no access to health care, that are probably under stress conditions, work conditions, because the work is really difficult. You're interacting, and you're usually bringing some domestic animal like chickens or pigs or something to be able to eat. Or they are actually going in and hunting bushmeat. So you have this really porous thing, so you have this laboratory. They're not gonna go to the local health clinic. So again, you're creating the conditions that are not just additive, but multiplicative. And you're doing this throughout one of the largest forested areas in the world, because all 8 countries of the Amazon basin have this problem. I also work in Southern Africa and Congo, DRC, and we see this as well. It's a problem that has a lot more similarities than the differences. So the getting back to like what is it on the ground, it feels, for people that work on the ground, it feels like you're swimming in waters that are way deeper than you see. It's like swimming in the middle of the ocean and it's 7 miles deep. And you're just aware of the 20 feet that you can see below your feet. But there's a sense that, you know, how can we solve the immediate issues of deforestation when you've got all these headwinds in front of you? So it is certainly a challenge, and especially for indigenous communities that are pretty much on their own at this point.
Well, I'm glad that you brought the Mexican cartel dimensions, because one of the factors that has really been changing the landscape of criminality in Latin America, already very intense, far more violent than criminality in East Asia, for example, is the bipolar war between Jalisco cartel and Sinaloa cartel, really playing out across the entire Americas all the way down to Chile, and reshaping in very many ways criminal markets, but also bringing the knowledge, the connections to East Asian and Chinese consumer places and Chinese criminal networks. Something that Andrea has done a lot of work. I will come to you, Andrea, in a second. But before we go to these places, let me just stick with the local. Luis, you said you come from New York. Daniel, you are someone who is heading the work of the International Fund for Animal Welfare on North America. And you are also doing work on new domain or newer domain, digital online space as facilitation of criminality, of wildlife trafficking. So tell us please about both. I have said several times that East Asian market consumers, but also rising affluent consumers in Africa are very significant vector in stimulating markets that are delivered by professional criminals. But we have these markets in the United States. We have them in this very city, in New York. Tell us please about your work in this respect. And I should say that before Danielle went to work for IFO, she was at the US Fish and Wildlife Service in the international program, where she had various roles, including as the lead communications officer, but also leading the government delegations to the CITES conventions, to the CITES meetings. Danielle, thanks.
Thank you. It is such an honor to be here today, and so much respect to all of you on the panel. My work within the U.S. and what we do is not in the crosshairs like many of you are, really taking down criminal networks and going deep. We are really looking at the work in the US that IFAW does is monitoring. We're looking at what is happening, open source platforms, things that you can go home, you can Google for, you can search for, you can find, you could click and buy right here in the US. And we've been looking at that for about 2 decades now. And so back when we first started monitoring, one of the first reports that I had worked on with IFAW, I was in graduate school at the time for conservation biology, got my foot in the door with IFAW as an intern, and was told to go start Googling, see what you can find online because we're doing this big report, and that was back in 2008. I thought at the time that it would be near impossible to find protected species, things for sale online. And that experience completely changed me. It was shocking at how easy it was to track down these products and record live rhinos for sale, ivory, mass amounts of ivory. And back when we were looking then, again, this was 15 years ago with that first report, about 75%, 77% of the items that we found were elephant ivory. We did another recent report just back in 2021, sort of want to update, see how things had sort of shifted. We still are finding significant ivory, elephant ivory that is for sale. So almost half of listings, about 44% of listings for protected species in the US were still that elephant ivory. We did see though, so it was a decrease, and that's largely because there's been a lot of regulation and policy put into place, largely because of the government leaning into this, the combating wildlife trafficking, the END Act that came through, a lot of policies that have come through and really put this on the radar to get stronger regulations in place. But even with those, even with stronger state laws on the book, we still see a significant amount of unverifiably not legal elephant ivory that's being traded. Also a good bit of taxidermy and trophies that we're seeing. So from all sorts of species. I remember back when I was at Fish and Wildlife Service, one of the most sort of egregious traffickers, or I don't know if quantity-wise that was, but there was actually, he made sculptures out of protected species. And sort of like what you would do with AI now, you know, what would happen if you put a bird and a tiger and a fish together, and literally that was the artwork that he was making and bringing in and trafficking in these protected species to sort of make these ghastly sculptures with. And so it is out there, it is readily available, and one of the most troubling trends that we've seen is an increase in the live animal sales. So again, ties back into all of these other threats with zoonotic disease spread. The live animal trade, primarily for the exotic pet trade in the US, is very prevalent on these open source platforms. Facebook Marketplace. So Department of Justice has prosecuted a number of those sorts of cases, tie them into money laundering and things like that, but they're seeing this trade that is happening. Eastern box turtles. So these are also species that are our species. They're US species. They're not just species that are coming in and being collected from other countries. We are also decimating our own species for collection for the pet trade and for other parts and products. So this is absolutely an issue that is happening in the US. It is something that all of us can be aware of, cognizant of, thinking about as we are doing our own online searches. Maybe not you personally, but other folks and friends that you're talking to.
So not to put it subtly, do not buy endangered wildlife online, and if someone else does, report it and dissuade them from it. Only buy sustainably produced wildlife and plant products. So speaking of being in the crosshairs, in the tough undercover, in the thick of investigation, facing threats in the Amazon and elsewhere, if Keith is the cool cop, the official cop, Andrea is the cool private eye. Doing the heroic work in the trenches, in the jungles. But Andrea is, of course, leading the Earth League International that has done tremendous amount of investigative work, very influential investigative work on wildlife crime. His work has been featured in various documentaries such as Netflix, The Ivory Game, and The Sea of Shadows. So Andrea, what is it like to be doing undercover work in the wildlife crime space? What is it like for your investigators? Give us some of the flavor without revealing anything sensitive or dangerous, obviously.
Sure. So I think to understand what we are doing now, there is a pivotal moment was 2009, 2010. I was in Kenya for my previous life, my previous career. I was in the private intelligence security industry, and we were working a lot with Kenyan politicians, Somali politicians. There was really interesting times back then. And because of my passion, I also was doing stuff on the side. So I was, we were talking about 2009, 2010, so that was right in the middle of the elephant poaching crisis. I don't know if you remember, we were losing tens of thousands of elephants every year, hundreds of tons of smuggled to China every year, so it was a catastrophe all over Africa. And I was going out with the rangers, Kenya Wildlife Service. I witnessed this awful poaching scene that you can't imagine. I briefly investigated also into the role of Al-Shabaab, but not so much into poaching, but mostly trafficking. And I remember being in the bush with the rangers in front of elephant killed, and I was thinking, wow, the whole world is asking these poor rangers that don't even have the shoes to solve this problem. And I thought that's crazy. I mean, it's like asking the last local sheriff we have in the US to tackle international drug trafficking. It's not for them. So, and because of my past, I start asking the question, so who is using professional intelligence to fight back? And Keith mentioned, we're talking about overall a business of over $200 billion per year. It's the third or fourth largest criminal enterprise. So I asked, who is using professional intelligence? By professional intelligence, I mean using in the same way we use intelligence to fight other global threats, terrorism, organized crime, mafia, and the answer was nobody. And so I thought, okay, maybe I can try. So I resigned, and I decided, working on Al-Shabaab and other stuff, first of all, I understood, for the first time, I understood what convergence was. And I thought, wow, that's way more than animals. It's more than elephants. It's much more, you know. Terrorist group, cartels are behind, so it's not just that. We have to inform the public about it. And one way to do it was my bet, was, okay, I bet that it's possible to build a small private organization, an NGO, a non-for-profit, with the same mindset and the same mentality of an intelligence agency like the CIA, for example, and try to do a similar work. So I started to recruit former FBI, former CIA, former law enforcement, undercover investigator, crime analyst, you name it, and I built this thing in 2013 because I wanted to push stakeholders to think in a different way. In 2014, I also established Wild Leaks, which was and still is the first whistleblowing initiative dedicated to environmental crime. And in 2015, I co-founded the Wildlife Justice Commission in the Netherlands that you mentioned before. Again, in the effort we need to change the way we tackle this problem. And so fast forward today, I have this organization with dozens of undercover operatives, different languages, working in different countries. Since the beginning, I thought, okay, we need an organization, a fact-finding organization, no hearsay. So every word we say or we write is backed by evidence collected firsthand by us. We record a lot of audio, video, documents. We collect all sort of information. We get really, really close to the most important wildlife traffickers and environmental criminals in the world. We infiltrate their networks. We become their friends. They invite us to dinners and weddings and birthdays, and we go. And we film everything, and we learn everything about them in the effort to help law enforcement agencies like HSI, for example, in their work, because sometimes these people are real ghosts. And I can talk for hours about environmental crime convergence, but I give you just one meeting to explain what environmental crime convergence is. So I had tons of this, but this is an interesting one. We were in a Central American country. I cannot tell you which one because it's still an active investigation, capital. Of course, as you can imagine, these big traffickers / businessmen / criminals, you don't find them in the jungle, you don't find them at sea. They're having a life in cities. You find them in Mexico City, in Bogota, in Lima, in Amsterdam or whatever. And so we had our undercover team was meeting this guy, Asian, big wildlife trafficker in the region. And the conversation started with, okay, I have a container of shark fins. I also have jaguar parts. I have timber as well. And he was talking to us about what he had. Then a second person arrived, a representative of one of the most important organized groups in the region. And the conversation shifted to money laundering and how to bring back the cash from the US to that country from organized crime activities. And the wildlife traffickers was involved also in that. And then a third person arrived. And the gentleman worked as the immigration at the local international airport. And the conversation shifted to human trafficking and human smuggling, and the wildlife trafficker was involved also in that. So that's how the top level of environmental crime looks like. If you're not able to research these people, if you're not able to get there, you are a Boy Scout for them. They absolutely don't care what you do or not do. So that's what it is, working undercover and helping law enforcement.
Thanks, Andrea. I am very glad that you brought up corruption as a fundamental, enabling, essential operating environment for any kind of criminality, and corruption that often reaches the very highest places and sometimes systematically takes over institution after institution. It's not just corrupt individuals here and there, but the entire government essentially functions as a mafia bazaar. Certainly very much featured in cases of wildlife trafficking, but in other forms of criminality. So fortunately, that's not our problem in the United States. There are certainly instances of corrupt officials, sometimes instances of cartels, in fact, seeding their officers to sign up for CBP, for example. But we have been fortunate that as a result of the resilience, checks and balances of our institutions, we haven't had the entire institutions captured. Nonetheless, there are challenges, Keith. What are the challenges for you in doing work against wildlife trafficking and environmental crime?
Well, I think one of the challenges we have is you always hear about organized crime. We don't always hear about organized law enforcement. So it's really getting everybody to come to the table, put egos aside, put the badge aside, and focus on the mission. So that's one of the challenges we have internally sometimes. Some of it's cultural, sometimes it's personality, but it's good that this is supported from the highest levels. Like I said, for the last 3 administrations, we try to get these stovepipes out of it. Other problems that we have, especially domestically, but even more so foreignly, is that when you look at most of the wildlife laws, or even just the environmental crime laws, the penalties are not really high. I mean, so there's really very little deterrence effect. So if you look at something like the CITES Convention, which is the backbone of pretty much everything that we do with our classifications with wildlife and some flora. It's codified under the Endangered Species Act in the United States, but you can do a year. You know, by way of comparison, if you use other cases or, you know, use these same charges, but for smuggling, it's up to 10 years. For, you know, for money laundering, it's up to 20 years. And we're one of the better nations that are more transparent and are more effective at going at it. There's other countries that you deal with and where they won't even make it to trial, and let alone they don't have the laws, they don't have the resources, they have weakened borders. And the issues like the corruption you talk about, you're already dealing with a fragile state, it just helps to degrade it. But that's one of the biggest things that we face is just dealing with the laws that are out there and just trying to get more support to try to make these penalties more strict. To try to get more people to understand the why issue. It's not just about biodiversity and convergence, which is absolutely important, but it's also about, hey, this is tied into the opioid crisis, which every small town, every big state, every national offices are concerned with and dealing with that. So those are the challenges we have, and then also even with the international community just communicating, and so trying to use these multinational organizations like the World Customs Organization, or trying to use someone like the like Interpol, to where everybody has a seat at the table, and you try to come to a common solution across the set. If nothing else, to at least illuminate it, so then later, if you like, when you discuss the END Act, there are name and shame provisions within that you can bring that out to the international community to hope that pressure can be put on it, or also even for just awareness for to reduce demand in some of these nations that don't realize that, oh, you have to kill the elephant to take the ivory, you know. So those are some of the biggest challenges that we face. And then just like everybody else in law enforcement, it's so many different demands. But again, that's where I think we really have to focus on these convergence concerns.
Thank you. You know, certainly it's the case in very many countries that environmental crime is at the bottom of priorities for law enforcement. In some ways that's inevitable. In other ways it's extremely unfortunate and problematic, obviously. And so, you know, when you talk about integrating the focus across law enforcement communities and agencies in the United States, that's very important. I have testified several times just last year on really moving away from our whole of fentanyl, whole of government approach on fentanyl to whole of government approach to organized crime, precisely to enable both the cross-semination of intelligence and information that's being gathered in prosecutorial capacities, but to get out of some of the stovepiping.
And on that same note, to reinforce what you're saying is, I think one of the issues too is, like we've learned on the war on drugs, we're not going to arrest our way out of this problem. And we have to look at different solutions, have to ask different questions when we finally get the whys, and look for different partners. I mean, one of the things that we try to do, especially in my unit, is we have great partnerships with these NGOs out here that are literally the tip of the spear on so many of these investigations, because they have access into certain countries we may not for political protocols, to work with academia, to find out, hey, to help these other nations that may be a little bit weaker in their technology or their capacity, what technology is out there, what research that can help reinforce them. And that's one thing that, you know, I really think that we, as my agency, and also law enforcement, have to look outside ourselves for these solutions. And like I said, it's really fortunate, you know, with this panel, is definitely a cross-section of what we try to look when we're dealing with these issues, and who has the best chance for success, whether it's domestic
Well,
or
I'm
foreign.
glad that you brought up other tools than enforcement, arrest, and prosecution, which is something I want to come back to a little bit later. But yesterday we had a fascinating session on tech, and in fact we have some of the presenters in the audience and some others in the audience who have invented, for example, a DNA identification machine that can identify DNA of different species right on the spot, something that's crucial in being able to mount effective law enforcement, but also have sustainable legal trade in wildlife products so that it doesn't serve as a mechanism for laundering and smuggling. Luis, let me turn to you. So you work in the Amazon, you work in the RC in South Africa. Those are places of not just great biodiversity, they are places of great variation in institutional context. So let's just stick in the Amazon with just 3 countries, Peru, Colombia, and Brazil. So in Peru, over the past 2+ years, we are essentially in the meltdown of the government. All the government is doing is lurching from one crisis to another, unable to engage in any governance at the time when illegal mining for ivory has spread across Peruvian Amazon, involves greater and greater number of actors, and there is essentially no government interest, willingness, capacity to act against it. Another place is Brazil, where the Bolsonaro government was complicit, encouraging, in enabling deforestation, logging in the Amazon. He is no longer the president of Brazil. Lula da Silva is now, and he has wants to resurrect his previous 2 terms, wants to see strong resurrection of environmental protection, reducing deforestation in Brazil. And then there is Colombia, where Gustavo Petro, again speaking very strongly about protecting the Amazon, but at the same time fantasizing maybe about legalizing cocaine and dealing with the wide panoply of armed actors, whether they are criminal actors or current insurgents, former insurgents. You know, how does the work in the trenches, being in the crosshair, intersect with the institutional settings? How can you operate in a place like Peru? What kind of strategies do you adopt there, vis-a-vis, for example, Brazil?
Yeah. So first of all, I'll say that, Andrea, your description of the convergence of environmental crimes is one of the best ways, because it really does represent how it actually feels. It's like peeling back the layers of the onion. Right? You think it's one thing, and then it's another, and it's this spider web of connections that it's really hard to get your arms around. So I had mentioned that I'm an ecologist, and the idea was to basically do good work on the ground. As initially as an academic, I actually spent time in the U.S. government working at EPA International Affairs, where I specialized in Mexico and then in Brazil. And then when I left, the idea was to go back to academia on understanding the greater context, and I had worked on international agreements like the Minamata Convention for Mercury and other agreements. But once you get in there, you start to peel that onion. And so to be able to do anything, you had to not only understand the legal challenges, the illicit networks, but also start to see how you can add value more than just the science that is the point, to be able to get that knowledge and to do better conservation. And so I actually, and a colleague of mine, started a private research institution, a similar concept to the way you did. Like, there's a need, no one's doing it. Over a couple beers, we basically said, if no one's going to do it, we might as well do this. And give it our best shot. And this was something that was started in 2014, that launched in 2016 with some very generous funding. And then the idea is like, well, what are the contexts in the countries we have to work? Starting from the low level and then realizing the problems were systemic for the most part. The case that you mentioned in Peru, there's been 5 presidents in 7 years. Last month there was a change in the Minister of Environment. I just learned yesterday that the Prime Minister Resign means the entire cabinet flips over. And so it's just this churn of people, so no decisions are made. Basically, it's just, it gets locked in. So it's very difficult to do things there, but you basically work at the subnational level. You work with municipalities, essentially like those dusty little towns with a mayor or a sheriff that wants to do something good. The one next door might be completely corrupt. And then sometimes they get killed, and then somebody else comes in. And so it is a bit of a patchwork. But there's also institutions that do really good work that persist, and you basically have to find the friends that you have. I mean, we do work with miners at a time, because to be able to have any ability to do work in places that have indigenous communities that are at risk for environmental crimes of all sorts, you have to, you know, if you're working in hell, you have to work with some devils sometimes. So in Brazil, I just arrived 2 days ago on a flight that arrived at 3 in the morning from Brazil, because I was working with IBAMA, which is the environmental crimes law enforcement agency for the government of Brazil. And we participated in a training and protocol exercise where we were working with prosecutors, we were working with the agents that were jumping out of helicopters, because the Amazon is so big that the Environmental Crimes Unit has 6 helicopters that are fully tricked out, essentially, to go to where the problems are at, with people jumping with fast ropes down to blow up mines, mining equipment, etc. But the idea is to have them collect as much information and samples, not just for science, but for evidence, so that federal environmental crimes prosecutors have the evidence to put away not just the miners, which are the equivalent of the street corner drug dealers. They need it for, you know, going to the middlemen, squeezing them, and going up the chain for something that is much more related to a RICO case, and take out the people that are funding these things and accessing those international or transnational sources of capital and influence. In Colombia, we actually have a new initiative where we're working. We actually opened up a second office. We're in the southern Peruvian Amazon because we formed the NGO in Peru, and not in the capital city, but in the Amazon area. There's a small town called Puerto Maldonado, which is the center of Madre de Dios, which is the biggest illicit, illegal mining area in the Amazon. With the idea that if the problem is there, the solutions need to be there, and we can iterate faster. We create laboratories. We have 2 of the only mercury laboratories in the Peruvian Amazon. We created a drone group, which is the largest drone group, where we have not only those little handheld quadcopters, but we have gas-powered drones that fly for 500 kilometers with 5-kilo payloads of all sorts of sensors that we have 3D printers there, where when they crash, we repair them. We have a team of AI researchers in a partnership with Dartmouth and with some NASA assistants that develop algorithms so we can analyze the amazing amounts of satellite information that we're getting. It's not just Planet Labs, but these things that are 30-centimeter resolutions. How can we leverage that? Not just access them, but process them fast and make them into tools that are not super fancy, that everyone can use, but for the people that need it to use, can do this. So we actually worked with prosecutors in Brazil for a tool that helps them understand when there's laundering of titles of land that are used for either conservation easements or for even mining, where someone has a license to do mining and they're not supposed to use mercury, probably do, but you realize that there's a tremendous amount of gold that's going through that one license. And no one goes to check. They just basically say, do they have a license? And they're pushing tons of gold through there, or kilos and kilos of gold. And then when you look at the satellite image, you see there's a lot of deforestation and destruction of all these areas, and everyone's basically pushing it through that one license. And that license, if you look at it, many times there's not even any mining on there, or maybe they mine a little bit. There's no physical way to do that. And I mean, and it's happening over tens of thousands of hectares. So we help them create a tool that basically accesses this so they can check it and tie it together. So it's just pushing things together. And so again, why does a conservation biologist, a tropical ecologist have to do this? because and try to bring those pieces together. It is frustrating, but in the absence of other people not doing it, I can't stand aside and say, well, somebody, we might as well wait and maybe this will get better. It's not going to get better. I mean, this is something that Alex Deegan had said, that the problems are multiplying faster than our solutions by a long shot. So we need to catch up, and we need to be faster if we have any hope that this is going to change.
Well, thanks very much, Luis. I want to leave at least 15 minutes of questions for audience, but I want to go back to Daniel and Monique before I do that. And to come to the theme of other tools for law enforcement. Keith very appropriately said, we are not going to arrest our way out of it. Yes, at the end of the chain are consumers in millions of people consuming illegally sourced wildlife and natural products. In between are the trafficking organizations. But often the producers, the poachers, are very poor people that nonetheless also are people who are politically influential, that do not like regulations, that can change how government acts. They certainly do not want to be subject to prosecution and law enforcement, but often oppose policies that restrict hunting, that restrict trade in wildlife trafficking. And a very significant aspect of conservation focuses on economic incentives for conservation, of allowing communities and people to utilize wildlife with the very powerful adage that wildlife stays when wildlife pays. Yet at the same time, the consumption often leads to unsustainable levels. Very tricky dilemma, and the policy pendulum swings between intense law enforcement to going much more to economic incentives, community-based natural resource management type of approaching, then back to economic incentives. So we're in the very law enforcement side of the pendulum, but we are also starting to see pushback against the pendulum. Countries in Southern Africa, rather, resenting that they cannot trade in ivory, pushing for allowing a trade in rhino horn. Countries like Cambodia and Laos wanting to have tiger farms. So Daniel and Monique, you have both looked at a wide set of interventions to deal with sustainability and to deal with suppressing the illegal aspects of wildlife trade. What are your thoughts on the economic incentives? Maybe Daniel, let me start with you.
Thank you. There's so much to respond to in that. I'm going to try to keep it brief. So a couple of things. So with regard to just sort of the volume of trade that's happening and keeping law enforcement ahead of that. One of the tactics that we're using at IFA is partnering with the technology companies. The Coalition to End Wildlife Trafficking Online, we have 47 companies globally now who have joined that coalition. We are working towards an industry-wide approach for them to remove listings from their platforms. We are also working one-on-one with them. So for example, in China, the leading platform there, Baidu, has started to implement some AI technology through their Paddle platform to be able to detect wildlife trafficking that's happening on their platforms. When it launched in 2020, it was at about a 75% accuracy rate. They've increased since then, but it's a challenge because again, always the traffickers are adapting too, so you're having to keep the models up with what's happening online. So we are trying to work through those sort of company incentive-based, incentivizing companies to assist with this problem. That gets caught with everything else that's on their plate, though. That's where the convergence happens for them, is that all of the same trafficking schemes, they're happening on the same platform. So they've also, that same small team that's looking for wildlife trafficking is looking for drugs and arms and human and sex trafficking too. So again, wildlife is gonna fall to a lower priority for them. And in terms of the valuation schemes of things, I mean, that's obviously, that's been a conversation that's been ongoing for decades, and certainly economic valuation and of ecological services is not a new topic, but I think as we're coming into, and we could have a whole other panel on this, nature-based solutions and climate change, we are really seeing governments, even here in the US government, looking at what is the, not just economic value of species, of natural places, but what is their value to us as humans? Yes, intrinsically, but also to our just overall ability to exist. How are they helping us to mitigate climate change and really deal with these issues that we have? So I think that shifting just economic valuation to a broader system of valuation for these species will help us address some of that.
Yeah, I think that everything Danielle said is definitely on the forefront of what we can be doing. But when it comes to convergence and kind of touching back on what Keith was saying and even Danielle now in terms of what these organizations and companies are dealing with when dealing with multiple issues, I think when it comes to the US and internationally, we have to think about converging our own forces in terms of bringing together, as Keith said, academics and policymakers and law enforcement and making everyone sit at the same table, kind of like we've managed to pull together here and people at different sides of the spectrum. But I think we've also seen more on the economic side, particularly with the US I've been most familiar with. We've seen a lot of funding from the US government, not only to be pushing law enforcement here in the US, but to be pushing that money into the field, into source countries, into countries where rangers don't have boots, where we're seeing mass corruption in their court systems, where we're just seeing issues where there's lack of training, lack of prioritization of wildlife issues, lack of knowledge on collection of evidence, presentation of evidence in court. They're dealing with so many issues, even when countries and organizations might want to be doing the right thing, sometimes they lack the capacity. So we're seeing a lot more funding from the US in particular in terms of those initiatives and sending people out into the field for ranger trainings, for prosecutorial trainings, for everything that you can possibly set forth there. So I think that is really a positive thing. And I think we're really starting to see a good bit of progress in that sense when we look at the rates of prosecutions and seeing the success of that growing and more evidence being successfully used within courtrooms. So I along with AI and natural language processing and everything that we can be fighting with on our side and funding DHS and funding wildlife services, looking at source countries and trying to kind of stop it at the source before it even comes into the US from our perspective, I think is critical.
Well, just one thing. Just to tie back to what Keith was saying too about policy, and I think one of my biggest fears right now is that we can't keep up with the speed of technologies when it comes to our laws and our policies. CITES is the sort of backbone, Endangered Species Act, of how we're protecting species in the US. The CITES parties only meet every 3 years, and it's rare that when a proposal is put forward the first time that they get that protection. When we have trends like happening on TikTok that are showing what type of exotic pet you should purchase next, we can't wait 3 years to put protections on species. So I think we really need to be thinking about what trades are not illegal now that really should be.
Thanks. So we heard few times the word deterrence mentioned, and what we know from various arms control deterrence fields, nuclear weapons. We have a very prominent nuclear arms control expert in the audience here. Is that deterrence works when it has two factors. One is sufficient penalty for misbehavior, for acting incorrectly, but the other is sufficient certainty of prosecution of the penalty occurring. So you can have a death penalty for homicides as long as the chance you'll be caught is 1 or 2%, or in the United States we often believe that it has to be at least 40%, you are not going to create deterrence, even with extreme penalty. So extending the certainty of punishment is absolutely vital for achieving not just incapacitation effects, but crucially deterrence effects, which is really when law enforcement becomes successful. So in a minute, I will ask the audience for 3 questions that I'll collect together and give our panelists a chance to respond. So please think about them. But Andrea, let me turn to you before that. Just in a minute, when have you seen most productive engagement with law enforcement partners in places that have often poor resources available in Africa, in Latin America? What are the ingredients for good partnerships?
Yeah, that's a good question, and also complex to answer. But well, in general, starting especially maybe 4 or 5 years ago, we started to work more and more with US authorities because they can do things that in other countries not possible, and not necessarily always in the US. Of course, not everywhere, but in the past, with my organization personally, we've been trying to help local law enforcement and prosecutors as well. It's really important to involve prosecutors to find a good, honest prosecutor in a country. Sometimes we just hand the documents to him only, bypassing everyone else. We've been trying to do it in Thailand, in Vietnam, and South Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, Peru, Colombia, Mexico, all over the places. And the problem is that in all those countries, they are not capable or willing, or both, to investigate the upper layers of this problem, okay? Not willing because, well, you can imagine why, corruption, but sometimes diplomatic reasons. I don't want to name the country, but there is a country in particular which is very powerful in these countries, so it's difficult for them to go after certain people. Also because some of
China.
I have the list of my enemies is already very long. I didn't want to add another one on the top.
I'm fast running out of countries that still give me.
But so they don't want to do it. But very often they're actually not capable of doing it. I no problem in saying that we recently had received a request by the Peruvian government to help them on jaguar trafficking, but by their own admission, they cannot do what we do, which is infiltrate those networks and stay for them for 2 years and get all the information. So what do? I don't know, honestly. Sometimes we help local prosecutors. Sometimes we share everything with US law enforcement, like a KID unit, hoping that they find a way to do it. And some other times, media. Yeah. Name and shame, okay, let's try to put it out. Of course, with caution because we risk our lives. But that's the problem. Just one word about the importance of convergence. So environmental crime convergence makes things more complicated, yes, but it also offers us the opportunity to tackle these people with using different crimes, charge them for different crimes, and gather different law enforcement agencies in a task force, because we are bringing not just wildlife, but human trafficking, money laundering, and narcos at the same time. So we are trying to change the game like that. I call it the reverse Al Capone approach. Al Capone was taken down, if you remember, for tax evasion. So we're trying to help law enforcement to take down these people for crimes that are more serious than wildlife crime. It's too easy to be taken for wildlife crime. It's not helpful. I want you to go to jail for human trafficking, and then maybe you learn the lesson. So that's why convergence is important also, not just a problem.
Well, thank you. Questions, I'll take 3. Okay, I have 3 up. Anyone else is out of luck. So please, I start with this gentleman, the lady behind him, and also you. And Bonnie, I'll make an exception for you. Please go ahead, sir.
Sorry, you mentioned some activities that are legal that should be made illegal. Why is trophy hunting of iconic species of big cats and elephants not a wildlife crime?
Don't answer yet. I'll just collect the questions, and so please hold your answers. Oh, sorry. So I need to restate the question. So the way I understand the question is, why is trophy hunting of big iconic animals like cats not
Big cats and elephants. We just lost.
Not illegal, correct?
Not illegal.
Right. Right.
Poacher goes to jail for shooting an antelope, but a trophy hunter goes to Safari Club International and gets an award.
So, in other words, why do we not have a ban on trophy hunting like Britain has instituted? Please hold your thoughts on the pros and cons of that approach. I'll collect the question.
Oh, yes. My question was related to maybe socioeconomic factors that might be driving folks to crime. I mean, I think it's widely understood that elements like poverty and other things drive people to crime regardless of what type of crime it might be. And so I think we've discussed tonight some of the punitive measures that we've taken, but I wonder how any of you
So let me restate the question for the recording. It comes back to other than law enforcement approaches to suppressing criminality, economic incentive, ecotourism, alternative livelihoods, addressing root causes to reduce the incentives that certainly lower level poachers have to participate in poaching and wildlife trafficking. And
yeah, thank you. So just applying all of this to a very specific example in South Africa, I'd be interested to know sort of what is the convergence there with rhino poaching, which seems to just be a continual problem. And the only way like it seems to be resolved is that they pretty much kill all the rhino in each sort of park as they're going through South Africa. And the government's almost doing next to nothing. So I'd be interested as that as an actual example of what kind of convergence is happening, what other crimes are related to that, that clearly gives these people some kind of supranational authority to not get arrested or taken out.
so the question was whether in the case of rhino poaching in South Africa, there are also elements of convergence, and how is it that rhino poaching networks are able to escape persecution and detection for as long as they have been. And Bonnie, you are our hostess. You have the last question.
And it's a very simple question. Danielle, if I find someone on the internet who is, or on the black web, who is dealing in wild animals, who do I call? What do I do? Let me just say, part of that answer is wild leagues.
Oh yeah,
Of course.
absolutely.
And I don't want to answer the question myself, but so that's very my.
So the practical question, those of you who identify the wildlife crime taking place online or otherwise, who do you call? Where is the hotline? How do you inform Earth League, Louis's outfit, law enforcement? With that, maybe let me start, Andrea, here. Just answer any of the questions from the audience that you would answer. Make it also your closing remarks.
Yes, I started from, I forgot, I remember rhino and trophy hunting. So trophy hunting, very long story. It's locally regulated. So a country like Tanzania, for example, decides that they allow trophy hunting.
I'm not talking about trophy hunting of an antelope.
No, including elephants.
I'm talking elephants.
Yeah, absolutely. We lost 2 big tuskers or 3 big tuskers in the past few days, and legally.
Yep.
And it's Tanzania government that decides what we can do, and I'm in favor. We should ban the importation of any ivory, for example. And it was actually for a while, right? So they can go there, but because most of these hunters really would like to bring back the trophy to America, to Europe, you simply not allow it. That's one way to do it, but unfortunately it's locally regulated.
And they're hiding the names of the hunters.
Of course, because they are fear of retribution, of course.
So if it was legal, why are they hiding?
Because they know that the public opinion don't like it anymore. That's why. And rhino, the convergence is not so much at the poaching level, but at trafficking level. Okay, poachers are just a poacher. Even when there are sophisticated poaching networks, are just poach. I mean, when I offer, it's not rhino, but when I offer you 2, 3 years, 5 years, 6 years of salary to kill an elephant, hell, you do it. Of course, I would do the same if I were there. Okay, we work a lot in Baja California on totoaba trafficking. Fisherman then makes $500-600 a month fishing normally, and one bladder is $2,000, $3,000, $4,000. Of course, you have to. And then I go back to yours a little. So yes, you have to. Yes, but in the case of Mexico, for example, they are in the middle of nowhere, absolutely nothing else to do other than fishing, and all of a sudden they have a fish swimming literally in front of them, and it goes for $4,000 or $5,000 a piece. Complicated. Locally, may change. So the rhino thing, rhino horn traffickers in Tanzania, in South Africa, Mozambique, we know for experience the traffickers, they are into rhino, they are into human, they are into timbers a lot at trafficking level. At poaching, not so much, but there's always the misconception that trafficking's, the origin of the problem is poaching, and then comes trafficking, and it's the other way around. It's because there's trafficking, the poachers kill. But the convergence on the trafficking side.
Okay, well, I can't help the questions about the poaching in trophy species or rhinos, but I very much can address the question about other things, especially related to socioeconomic drivers for this, because the organization I founded is the Centro de Innovación Científica Amazónica. It's a Center for Amazonian Scientific Innovation. We're a science center. We are a research center where we do we generate evidence that we publish in scientific papers, and we've had to, because of where we work and the system in which we live, that some of that evidence goes for law enforcement to make their jobs more effective. I do want to touch that scientific evidence is key. One of the foundational principles about actually generating science that evidences the impact allows governments to pass laws that are unpopular, going against currents for corrupt officials, including people in Congresses and stuff like this. So if you demonstrate conclusively impacts, it's harder to knock it down and just say it's an opinion piece. And we've suffered this in the States with many things, including the pandemic. But basically, you can generate the evidence, and the best way to create evidence is scientific information. It puts the steel in the spine of lawmakers in many countries, and this is why we work specifically with key administration officials and lawmakers, where we give congressional testimony about, not from a law enforcement perspective, but this is what's happening to animals, this is what's happening to people, this is what's happening to the shape of rivers and forests that disappear essentially overnight. The other side of that coin is not just for the benefit of policymakers, which in some complicated fashion will fix things, but education and outreach to communities directly. We have a team, and communication. So we have a team that is education and outreach, where we work with state education, education agencies, where we create curricula that goes K through 12. In the issue of the value of wildlife in the Amazon. Many of these towns are mining towns stuck in the middle of the Amazon. They don't go out to the forest. They don't actually know the value. We take them out to the, well, we work with teachers that take them out to the field, and they're taught from when they're little to when they graduate from high school of the value, and some of that based on the evidence that we do through our science work. We have a very dedicated team of 40 Peruvian and Latin American specialists that are in country that do this work. The last part is the communications with the press. That's something that they touched on. That is critical. This diagonal pressures, something that it is not face-on, but working with allies that do environmental reporting, not just environmental crimes reporting, but just getting the word out that this is happening has been transformative. Organizations like Mongabe, traditional ones like Science and Nature in their reporting part, because those are usually syndicated and they flow down and everyone uses them. Mongabe as well is now almost the de facto environmental reporting thing, where newspapers around the world copy this, but also at local levels. We have essentially like a show on the local radio run by the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church gets to every little town, including the mining towns on AM radio and shortwave. So having an approach where you have this kind of, not whole of government, but whole of effort. Because otherwise there's something that's gonna fall between the cracks, and then they squeeze through that little hole.
So I think one thing that ties all three of the questions together is realizing that crime is very often business driven, whether you're dealing in narcotics or arms or humans or wildlife. And when we're talking about low-level poachers being involved in wildlife trafficking, or if individuals are farming coca or what other narcotics in their fields. It's typically driven at the lowest level by economic opportunity, and we see that when you do come in with ecotourism opportunities, with other community conservation initiatives to give people some sort of alternative, they will most often take it. That's obviously kind of stepping aside the issue of cultural consumption of certain animals, but that's not the main driver of, you know, kind of what we're talking about at the highest level with conservation and convergence. So I think kind of looking at the bottom level, looking at it in terms of individuals trying to look for some sort of income, some sort of protein, some sort of whatever is critical, and there is definitely success in bringing different ventures into those organizations, or even kind of like beehive fences to prevent human-elephant conflict, and teaching those communities to use the bees to have the honey, to have other economic opportunities. Like, it all ends up coming together. And with the rhino poaching, again, kind of as was mentioned, it might not be the poachers themselves that are necessarily involved in convergence, and I think we see, particularly with rhino poaching, very, very specialized individuals that have, you know, skills with specialized weapons, can use technologies to find rhinos, to hunt rhinos, what have you. But we see at the trafficker level, again, it's business. So if they have the corrupt oiled routes to ship ivory horn and have dealers for that, why wouldn't you add cocaine to that shipment, or, you know, whatever's in the marketplace? So I think when you kind of look at these individuals, as Andrea was saying, as a business person in Johannesburg or in wherever, it's a business. So you definitely kind of moving up the ladder tend to get more and more convergence. And I mean, same with trophy hunting. I think the biggest problem is that there's corruption, and people are making decisions based on money, whether they're justifying it by, well, this individual is gonna pay $30,000 to kill an elephant, and they can't or don't have the willpower or the know-how, whatever, to turn away from that. It becomes a larger business and political transaction on whether a country wants to lean into it and keep it versus turn away, and what that means politically for other countries. When we say, well, we're not going to do it, then how is the U.S. going to react to that?
So we have vast over time. Absolutely, yeah. Daniel and Keith,
yep.
I want you to have a chance, but please
very brief.
Answer, please.
So I'll try to quickly touch on the trophy hunting bit and answer Bonnie's very straightforward question. Thank you for that. So with regard to trophy hunting, IFAW does not support trophy hunting, but we do support the governments and the communities that live alongside the wildlife. And so it's really on us, it's on those of us who think that there are alternatives, to work with those communities, to work with those governments, to find other ways, as Wanda has said before, to get that economic incentive, to see a different approach. And so that is very much, you know, how we work. We go in, we're working with governments to find and provide them and help co-create those alternatives with them. And then in terms of reporting, if you guys do see, so many of the online platforms have reporting buttons that we work with now. So if you go in to report what looks like a problematic ad, some of them actually say, you know, is this a criminal activity? Some of them will have wildlife listed as one of the options. So you can absolutely do that. Wild Leaks is a great option to report into as well. I would say go straight to Fish and Wildlife Service. Funny story though, when I was at Fish and Wildlife Service, sometimes law enforcement would come to me for things that were like, they weren't going to investigate, and say, can you contact IFAW and World Wildlife Fund? They're our partners in the coalition, and can they contact Etsy to get this posting down? Because there are sometimes, right, those postings that are just somebody didn't know. It's not a trafficker. It's somebody that, you know, inherited their aunt's pearls or their ivory, and they're selling it. So you can always, also, I'm sure there's a Fish and Wildlife Service tips line. Keith can probably tell you the exact line for that. I think it's 888 FWS tips, but you can confirm.
Oh, I don't know.
Okay.
Different agencies.
Oh, right.
I can only give you mine, yeah.
And so you could report into
You could
HSI as well.
Yes, to hsi.dhs.gov. There's a line there to leak in. So if you need to send information in, we'll look into it. If we can't do something with it personally, we'll reach out with one of our partners, or reach out with, like, the International Association of Chiefs of Police has an environmental crime section. So that's an immediate touch point that we can go into them to get it to the right jurisdiction, especially if it's not a federal violation.
That's great. And I mean, really, this is a small enough group. I feel like we're all friends now. I'll give you my card afterwards. If you don't know where to report it, Send it in. We'll figure out if it's a company thing or if we need to elevate it to law enforcement.
Oh, thank you so much. One of the issues I want to bring up on the rhino that actually wasn't addressed is Andrea, along with John Jay University, wrote pretty much the convergence paper dealing with this issue on classifying it, how we talk about it in, in our vernacular, both within the academic community and as well as within the law enforcement community, how we'll revert to it. In dealing with that, when you talk about the multi-species convergence, we do see a lot of that. And one of the bigger challenges that we had in South Africa was when they started the legalization of horns, that created an immediate gray market. And we're seeing impacts from that. Because a lot of what we're seeing coming from there will either go further up to Kenya, make its way to Asia, or make its way to Nigeria. A lot more with ivory than horn, but it's the same networks. Again, it's multi-species, or they call it a species agnostic network. That they're just using their infrastructure, their illicit pathway to push that forward.
Well, thank you very much to all of you for a really terrific conversation. Thanks to the very probing questions. Hold your applause just for a second. Thanks to the very probing questions from all of you. Enormous thanks to our panelists. I said enormous thanks to our panelists. Thanks to the audience. I think it's important that we have this conversation and that we continue having the conversation, because many of the topics that have emerged, many of the solutions are hotly contested. There are wide set of views in practice, in policy, among scientific community as to many of the tools. The effects and effectiveness of many of the tools adopted is highly varied across geographic spaces, across institutional settings, highly varied across times. Their political sustainability often is undermined. So this is not the one-shot conversation, and I am absolutely delighted and thankful to the Explorer Club that it has started focusing on conservation, on issues like wildlife trafficking, and introducing it to the very core of the club. And I look forward to those conversations continuing, because at the end of the day, they are political, and there will be not just based on science, they will be based on politics. They will be challenged, explored, changed. And yet, we need to make sure that there are wild spaces to explore, and there are wild animals in them to be explored. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank this wonderful panel, Vanda, for leading it. Therein is the last part of the inaugural Global Conservation Forum, I say GCF. We hope you'll come back next year. We'll be having events throughout the year, and next year we'll have an even larger event.